a couple of points just to throw some ideas out there and see what response we get. My background is really pro-life feminism, and what I would argue is that abortion offers a male response to a female problem, or a female situation, not even a problem. What it says really is, men don't get pregnant, women do. Therefore, if a woman falls foul of that peculiar female tendency to get pregnant, we have to do everything possible to make her unpregnant. And really, for over 50 years, the dominant strands of feminism have viewed motherhood as a form of imprisonment, and pregnancy, therefore, as a disaster from which women need to be liberated, rather than as a powerful and uniquely female act to be celebrated. So I would argue that in situations where motherhood is a struggle, and I think it is sometimes quite a struggle for women, that is the fault of society's negative attitudes towards mothers and their failure to support them, not the fault of motherhood itself. And the abortion culture in which we live is making it much harder for mothers than it was in the past. And the hard cases, of course, have got mentioned a lot already this conference and will continue to be mentioned. I do think that abortion is a male solution, particularly in case of rape. It assumes a level of emotional inadequacy on the part of women. How often have you ever heard people say she'd be reminded of the attack every time she saw the baby? It's an assumption that's made all the time that women somehow can't really be trusted. It also reinforces the idea of male ownership of a child. During the debate over David Steele's abortion bill in the 60s, a pro-life MP reportedly said, "A child is not the chattel of the mother, but neither is a child the chattel of the father," and that is what abortion as a result of rape assumes. I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said that those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves. And I do not believe that women can achieve full equality at the expense of innocent life. I don't believe that can ever be the case. It is sometimes the case that human rights compete with one another. The right to bodily integrity, the right to life, for example, in this case. And it seems to me self-evidently the case that when those rights compete, the fundamental right must be the one that wins out. In this case, the right to life, without which other rights are pretty meaningless. It's not to say that women do not have rights, but it's also to acknowledge the obvious point that the unborn also have rights. There's a tendency to see the whole of human history almost as one kind of road to progress and liberation, of which abortion is somewhere up here as a pinnacle of liberation. But that has never been the case. The early feminists did not see abortion as a right. It was only in the 60s that women's groups started to take on the idea of abortion as a right, and it was only really because of the sexual revolution, the so-called sexual revolution. It really had nothing very much to do with getting equality for women. It was to do with changing attitudes towards sex. And it is relatively recent. What we are living in at the moment is really quite an artificial situation, where we have lost any sense that there is a problem with this. And in fact, even though it probably doesn't seem that way, abortion is not as entrenched in public opinion as you would think. The majority of people have a problem with abortion at some level, disagree with abortion on some level, and those are the people we need to be reaching. We shouldn't be afraid to question the dogma of choice. It has become a dogma and it must be questioned. We shouldn't be afraid, as women particularly, to be the heretics of the feminist movement. Thank you.
Very beautiful. It is very true that abortion is the male solution for many, many things. If you are
an activist in the field, you'll know that very, very often abortion is not a woman's choice. It is often forced by boyfriends who threaten with, then I'll never see you again, and almost without fail, after the abortions, the relationship breaks up nonetheless. But there is, as we have increased in our anti-life abortion culture, if you will, an increasing damage to men that, I'm sorry I was taken up with what's going on medically with my son, so if I'm repeating what's been said, please just say that's enough. But what we have now among men, this growing group of men who have experienced abortions, some of the same effects, at least on the psychological level, that are experienced by women, from different perspectives. Men generally are by nature sort of leaders, providers, and protectors. The sort of main sort of things of a guy. And those roles are completely thwarted with abortion. And that has a profound effect on men. We've seen an increasing number of men who would like to have had their child, but were completely, utterly powerless. Often the scenario is, you know, a boyfriend, girlfriend, however young, or today even older, where the woman finds herself pregnant, tells the fella, you know, and the scenario, it's not frequent, but it has happened, and you're seeing an increasing number of men come with these problems. The men come and say, well, let's have the baby, let's go ahead. And the woman, usually under pressure from either job or family, most often family, says, no, we just can't do this. I've decided we're going to do this, and go ahead with the abortion. The effect on men is severe in those circumstances, in all the circumstances of abortion, but in this case, in that scenario, the man is deprived of that massive role of protection for their own child. And it causes huge psychological problems. It's a very typical case of this happening in a scenario, sometimes even within a marriage. And as men typically react, become withdrawn. All of a sudden, the fella, let's say in a marriage where this has happened, he sort of said, no, I think we should go ahead and have a baby. No, we can't, and the abortion's done. The most common reaction probably is one of withdrawal, complete withdrawal from family life. Very often there's a breakup, and what's happened? He just withdrew into himself. He's not paying attention to us in the family anymore. It's gone. He's been gone. Most of us never connected to the abortion. Another very typical reaction, in fact, this one by clinicians, is the universal reaction of men who have had abortions, who've had abortions happen to one of their children, is anger. Now, the anger is all sorts of misdirected. In extreme circumstances, you've had men reacting against women, and not only their girlfriend or spouse at the time, but all women, and become very violent and so on. But anger is a universal reaction that men tend to have. And there is a lot of damage that comes through these, both to themselves and to their spouses, their girlfriends, etc. You know, there have been murder cases connected to men who have had, their children aborted. We have famous cases in Canada where a man ended up killing his father and mother, brutally as well. So there are all of these effects. One of the ways that men deal with abortions after effect is to drown themselves drinking drugs and into promiscuous relationships, etc. You see that pattern, of course, in women as well. And most often, at least with men, the way to health is through counseling, and most effectively with men. There are some women who can help men who have undergone abortion with their children, but it's the most easy way, or the most prevalent way that works, is to help them from counseling from other men. The end goal, of course, is actually forgiveness. they have to be able to forgive themselves for either encouraging, but in these cases I've been speaking of, it's for not being into or not protecting their own child, not protecting their spouse or girlfriend from the abortion. And obviously the most successful way of doing this has been through a relationship with God.
Thanks very much, John Henry. There's a lot of really rich material there, and I'd like to flesh that out in the question time. So if anyone has a question, could they please stand up and either come to the front or speak quite loudly. I will repeat the question, but it would be helpful if you did raise your voice. So do direct a question at either or all the speakers.
So can I stand up?
Okay, go ahead, yeah.
Sorry, should I stand up or am I okay?
Please, yeah.
Okay, question for Fiorella. I completely agree with what you say, particularly the question of bodily integrity versus the right to life. Completely agree with your conclusion. However, do we have to find a situation where we respect a woman's right to do what she likes with her body? For example, I don't think anyone here would like to go back to the Napoleonic Code, which said that a man sort of had control of his wife's reproductive system. So is there a way we can respect a woman's desire not to get pregnant in the first place without compromising the right of a child's life to be born?
Yeah, so the question basically is, how do we balance women's right to bodily autonomy with the respect for the right to life? Without, we don't want to go back to perhaps certain attitudes in the past that compromise women's autonomy.
And should have rights over a woman's reproductive system.
I'm not suggesting that's what people are doing.
Yes, also, I think the question of bodily integrity is quite a broad one. Mm-hmm. It doesn't just pertain to the reproductive system. Men and women have a right to bodily integrity. They have a right to refuse treatment, for example, even if that treatment would be very good for them. Say, it's perfectly possible to respect a person's right to make a choice that may not be the right choice. However, in this case of pregnancy, it is a unique situation. It's very difficult, really, to make any kind of analogy. I mean, people try to make the analogy, the violinist with the person who gets kidnapped to be life support for the violinist and things like that. I mean, none of them really make any sense. When it comes to pregnancy, if a woman is pregnant, there are two people there you have to think about. Any doctor worth his salt really ought to see two patients there that he or she has to help. And we need to be completely supportive in that case. Pregnancy can sometimes be very difficult for a woman, and to offer her the support that she needs. Yes, there are perfectly valid situations in which a woman may not wish to become pregnant. I rather resent, I have to say, in the whole debate, the way people talk as if women suddenly wake up and discover they're pregnant. It generally involves a certain act occurring in order for them to become pregnant. No, but seriously, it tends to be completely divorced from any situation that may cause the woman to become pregnant. I mean, I might catch a cold by accident. I'm unlikely just to become pregnant without a flu. Something has to happen first. And I think there is such a thing as sexual responsibility too. The fact is, it is a procreative act. I mean, I have in debate had people say, no, it's great if that's for you, if that's what you think, but for most people it's got nothing to do with procreation. Well, I'm married to a biochemist. There are certain biological facts you can't get around. It does sometimes result in pregnancy. And the majority of women who present for abortion do so because of failed contraception. It's not because they've never heard of the pill, which is another thing that the other side tend to claim. No, I'm not saying that every woman should go out and get pregnant either. I think, the fact is, if a woman does become pregnant and she didn't intend to, it can be very traumatic, it can be very, very difficult. Frankly, even if a woman did plan to become pregnant, if she's ill, if her circumstances change, that can be very tough. And that's where we have to be there for a woman in that situation. And we have to respect, the difficulties a woman is going through. But I don't think we can ever collude in evil and collude in the death of an innocent, which is in the end what abortion involves.
Great, thank you very much. Further questions?
Dr. Newton, yeah. I wonder how you would articulate this. So, I'm not totally convinced that there is absolute autonomy between a husband and wife over their reproductive powers. Meaning, I don't feel I am autonomous once I'm married in regards to my reproductive power, because I've given that right in a certain way over to my spouse, or at least we share it in common in a certain way. So I don't know whether anybody wants to say something about the question of absolute autonomy over reproductive potency or power in marriage.
So the contribution of Dr. Newton is about the question of, is there an absolute autonomy over our reproductive powers, or do, for example, husband and wife give that reproductive power to each other, or share that reproductive power in common?
Well, I think I've just done a master's in medical ethics recently, and the focus was very much on autonomy. And I just have a real worry about this whole focus on autonomy. So I basically agree that in a marriage, in an ideal situation, husband and wife love each other, and there's a intense trust, etc., etc. As part of my voluntary work, I work in Sri Lanka, and I've come across a number of women who are going for illegal abortions, and I have to say that their circumstances are dire. They are in relationships where they're being exploited by men, and it's very easy for an organisation like Marie Stopes, who worked there, to come along and just offer them abortion, but they don't see the full picture, that these women are not sort of your typical women from Cosmopolitan magazine who are making choices. They're being forced into situations, they're being coerced. And I mean, there's a wonderful nun who I work with in Sri Lanka who's going around offering these women alternatives to abortion. And, they are people who are not in an autonomous sort of state, so they are kind of being put in situations where governments and powers like the United Nations, Marie Stopes, all these great global organizations are putting pressure on them to abort. And that's what they don't want. They don't want to abort. They want support, really. So I just veer away from the whole principle of autonomy.
John Henry?
I could respond just from a slightly different perspective, and that's just that in terms of holding that autonomy, I fully agree, you do give it away when you get married. You give it away to your spouse. In a way, you give to one another and both of you to our Lord. And in our marriage, we just basically said we practiced not natural family planning, sort of either you can call it supernatural family planning or whatever you want, Lord. And the truth of the matter is, it's the absolute most beautiful thing. And many people think oh gosh, you have 8 children, gosh, or even worse than that. And I can tell you, it is the most absolutely beautiful thing to have a large family. I don't want autonomy over my sexuality. I want God to have the control, and He does beautiful things with it.
So just to finish, I think, picking up on what you both said, we have lost the sense of sex actually being an act of mutual surrender, that it is actually to do with self-giving. I was astonished to read some years ago that Amnesty International had included a sexual rights manifesto which included the right to sex. That seems to me to be breeding a nation of rapists, not actually encouraging sort of wholesome relationships. You can't talk in terms of rights to the same extent when you're talking about 2 people, because as soon as someone has a right to sex, someone else has a duty to provide it. You lose the plot in a way. And just picking up on what you said about women having illegal abortions in difficult situations, it horrifies me how openly aid agencies will talk about providing contraception and abortion as some kind of remedy to abuse of women. They are not dealing with the abuse. I've seen programs, pro-abortion programs, saying, oh yes, lad, don't worry about the husbands, don't worry about husbands, ladies. You can have an IUD fitted, they'll never know, so when they're making demands on you, you won't get pregnant. What they're doing is giving that woman a device so she can go home and be raped by her husband. They're not actually dealing with the problem, they're not giving her a way out of that relationship. They are just papering over it and actually facilitating the abuse of women. I mean, for me, that is a huge scandal that's not being noted.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question, please.
My question is mainly to Fíorell on a kind of practical note. Do you see that, unfortunately, a lot of the time now, the term feminism is synonymous with pro-choice in modern society? Do you see like a way forward in terms of for people who are pro-life and hold that view to find themselves as feminists and rebrand the issue and bring to life true feminism, or do you see it as a time for pro-life to detach itself and kind of surrender that kind of movement in a way.
So the question is generally about is there a future called pro-life feminism?
I know that there is a lot of concern about association with feminism because radical feminism has been so damaging and it is so synonymous with abortion and with all the consequences of that. There is a growing movement of pro-life feminism, sometimes called fourth wave feminism. It's very much connected up with the new feminism that John Paul II referred to in Mulieristic Platon. And I think it's very exciting. In fact, it is trying to go back to the thinking of the early feminists, and it's not just about opposing abortion, it is also about trying to get men and women working together for the common good. It's putting forward a much more positive, to my mind, attitude towards womanhood. And I think it has a future, I think it is going somewhere, but it is still very early stages.
Want to come in on that? Or no, we would. Okay, next question, please. Nick.
I'd like to know if you believe there is a difference between the percentage of men and the percentage of women that regret an abortion, and if there is a difference, why do you think that exists?
Yeah. So the question is there a difference between rates of men and women regretting abortion, and if so, why?
Most of the studies have been done on women who have had abortions, and the men who have been involved in abortion studies are very few and far between. As John mentioned, the focus has been on men who become angry, substance misuse. So all these things are picked up, but the studies aren't that good. I mean, my own suspicion, my own view is that abortion is going to affect men and women equally. But in terms of the research out there, they're few and far between. There's a lot of research, very good research, I would add, done by pro-life organizations, but sadly, they are rejected by, if you like, the academics. Interestingly, like I mentioned in my talk, a study by Steinberg working with Lawrence Feiner from the Guttmacher Institute, that gets reported in all the journals. Monk Olson, whose study was funded by Warren Buffett, again, that gets reported. So there's a lot of research out there, but it's done by pro-life organizations. So they're not really, sadly, accepted at this moment. But my suspicion is that a lot of men out there have been affected. If I may use my own clinical experience, in psychiatry, I came across a young man who whose girlfriend had an abortion, and he took drugs in order to get in contact with his unborn child. And he was getting visual hallucinations of his unborn child. And he decided it was a boy, and he'd given this boy a name. And he was very, very psychotic at the time when I saw him. But you could see that the real underlying issues were to do with his desire to have not been involved in the abortion.
Just very quickly to add to that, I will be talking a little bit more about this tomorrow in my presentation, but there has been a lot of resistance, even to men being allowed to express an opinion on the abortion of their own children, and also men tend to find it harder to express grief, so are slightly less likely to admit to regret as well. So there are quite serious problems in that field, but more on that tomorrow.
Okay, Lady Trump.
I recently just handed in my dissertation on the impacts gender equality has on fertility rates and sort of like the policy implications behind that. And I wish I'd had this conference before to sort of have more fuel in it, but it's a bit late now. So what, as future politicians, or if we do go into politics, or as the youth of today that do have influence on future generations, what sort of aspects behind, like, Catholics tend to have this stereotype of big families. Well, as we've seen by a lot of speakers, they do come from big families, so it follows that. But other countries sort of have this lower level fertility, which could be contraception or abortion or other aspects involved. So what can we do as the youth of today to sort of encourage, like with politicians now, or help, like obviously we can talk to our friends and encourage them, but sort of get more of a a larger movement and greater understanding of all this in terms of policies to help facilitate all these.
Yeah. So the question basically is how can the pro-life youth of today increase the awareness of issues regarding appropriate gender equality and fertility? So pro-life understanding of gender equality and fertility. What can young people do about that vis-a-vis politicians and government policies?
Well, the first thing we have to do is to try and work with the culture that we're in and change that. Because I was thinking, with all my wonderful research, if I went to, not my own research, but what I've read about the research, if I went to Parliament, say, and told Mr. Cameron or whoever that, the psychological issues are, of the Abortion Act are, sort of, they don't exist, basically. What's going to happen is there will be, the current situation now, there will simply be abortion on demand up to 12 weeks. So they won't sort of talk about the psychological impacts of abortion at all. Now, in the 1960s, when David Steele was focusing on the Abortion Act, he was really focusing on things like, women being turned into mental wrecks unless they have abortion. So all that seems to have gone, and we're now living in a culture which seems to be accepting abortion as simply a right, and that's what I think needs to be, we need to address that. We need to try and change the culture. And if I was perfectly honest, I would love to work with pro-life politicians, but well, there aren't that many out there. So we have to sort of try and create a next generation of pro-life doctors, pro-life nurses, pro-life politicians, and that's about change of culture.
Could I just throw to Robin just quickly? Yeah.
What I would say to you is live good lives, your own lives. I mean, yes, you can go and bash the politicians at their surgeries, and you can write them letters, and you can, and in your own work, I mean, some of you will be historians, some of you will be mathematicians, doctors, lawyers, all sorts of different things. So in your own lives, you can do the work, the research work, if that's what you want to do, or just in your work in a good way, with a capital G, and lead good lives and good family lives. Don't take in just what you're told from the outside, as my generation did. I'm from the 60s, and we just took it all in and we thought, oh, right, yeah, summer of love and all that nonsense. Well, you had the opportunity of getting some warnings. This is only the beginning, really, for you. Take that, take it further, and live good lives. And treat your family, your wives, your husbands, and your children in a proper way.
Yeah.
The 1960s was one big party, wasn't it? Really? I hope it was fun. We're clearing up the mess. Sorry. I think the single biggest, most important thing you can do is just don't go away. Refuse to shut up. There was something went around Twitter. I think it was Bristol students had a bit of an altercation with the students' union at some stage, and someone said, well, hopefully all the pro-life students will shut up now. Fat chance. No. We're just starting on that score. So the most important thing is that you are providing a voice. Also, it's important to get the facts out there. It's important to get the information out there. When it comes to gender equality, one of the reasons I talk so much about pro-life feminism is I'm keen to make the point that abortion is, not only is it destructive, it is not necessary for women to achieve equality. It is much easier to be a mother, in a material sense at least, now than it was 50 years ago. There is employment law. FPA put out a leaflet some years ago in which they made it out that you lose your job if you had a baby. That is a lie. That is illegal. You can't sack a woman because she's pregnant. Or you can, but then you get taken to a tribunal. And I know women who've successfully prosecuted their own employers for that reason. So we need to get the facts out there that it doesn't end your life. I'm not less of a woman because I've had 4 children. I don't feel less powerful as a woman because I've got 4 children. That there isn't this contradiction that's been created. Also, there are studies, if you look somewhere like Chile, for example, they're an interesting case because they legalised abortion and then criminalised it again in 1989. So there's all these years of information and data showing things like maternal death rates and stuff like that. And what you see is that maternal death rates have carried on declining with abortion being illegal, so it was never necessary to save a woman's life. And also, there are more women in education. Women are actually doing very well. And what they found was the longer a woman spends at school, the longer she spends in education, the better she does later on. She will tend to have a smaller family because she will settle later on. She will get married later. So there are all sorts of issues there that have been completely ignored by the other side. So we have to be out there giving them the information.
Can I just add something to that as well? Two things following on from what Fiorella said. First of all, the main thing you can do, and all 88 of you, or how many there are, is keep the truth alive. Because if you don't, it's gone. And somebody said to me the other day, he read a quotation from somebody saying that the sad thing is that oppression and persecution does work, which is a rather terrifying thought. But even in the direst oppression and persecution, and we're not at that by any means, and I hope that never comes to you, but even in the direst oppression and persecution, in places like Nazi Germany and in Russia and in China, people's spirit still keeps going. And to some extent, I encourage you to keep that spirit going in your own lives.
Thank you very much, Robert.
There was another thing, I've forgotten it now.
All right.
That's old age, so carry on.
Next question, please.
Thank you very much both for your comments. My question is kind of about the media. The March for Life in Washington and the whole Howard Gosnell trial have really highlighted issues of like willful media ignorance, especially in the States. That's where I'm from, so that's basically all I know. But
yes.
How would you? This is kind of a follow-up to the last question, but how would you? What would you recommend for going about in changing that conspiracy of silence somewhat to in the media, especially in the Western media?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we go about changing the media bias against the pro-life movement?
Citizen journalism. It has never been easier to circumvent the traditional media. I was actually at an author's event, so I'm also a novelist, last week, and the publishing industry is getting very jittery because of self-publishing, because they've had a stranglehold over what books get published for so long that they're now finding people, thanks to digital printing and online networking, can sell their own books without the help of Penguin and Orion and all these big people. The same is true of the media. If the media refuses to report something, there are blogs, there's Twitter, there's Facebook, there are all sorts of other ways of getting the information out there. And just as the publishing industry is having to listen to the indie authors who are circumventing them, I think the media is starting to have to listen to these other sort of unofficial platforms. There was a case some years ago, a horrendous demonstration outside one of the big cathedrals, it was in London, I think, and there was a complete media blackout. It was not reported anywhere. One blogger took photographs. I think he got 25,000 hits in the first hour, and then it went viral and went all over the world. That was a particular case. So take to the social networking sites.
Yeah, definitely. Just to follow up on that, just as the communications manager, that we have a blending today of traditional media and the new socially network-based media, and you have the melding of news and opinion. You've got a melding of all different platforms and channels and ways of getting the message out. So one can leverage that so that you use those alternative channels to have a leverage on the mainstream media and break that bias, break that silence.
Can I just can I ask, how many people in here have heard of Howard Gosnell?
Howard Gosnell?
Howard.
Kermit
Gosnell, yes.
Well, we have.
Well, Howard's his brother. There were quite a lot, yeah, quite a lot, but quite a lot haven't. Which just shows, and you're an audience who are interested in this subject, and yet quite a lot of you haven't heard of him. And he was an abortionist in Pennsylvania, I think, Philadelphia. But anyway, Pennsylvania. Who, I mean, the stories of his abortion clinics are just horrible. I mean, just absolutely disgusting. And yet, what has been in the media has been very, very low. And I agree entirely with Fiorella about the question of social media, internet, so on. I went to a discussion not so long ago about the internet, and chap giving the discussion said that the internet and the media generally is like a foreign country, and the people of my generation, we can just about get by, and I can work a computer and I can do emails and I can just about set up a blog and do this, that and the other. But your generation and younger, and even the ones below you are better than you are. People 10 years younger than you are better than you. But you are, it's as if I'm in a foreign country and I can just about speak the language, whereas you are fluent in the language. And as I say, the people coming up are even more fluent than you are. So that's a bit frightening. But, so that is certainly something that you can use. We do our best, we try, but you're much better at doing that. So that's something that definitely you can do to get around. Of course, one of the dangers is that our opponents also are able to do this. So, the battle continues.
Okay, maybe we'll have one more question before the break.
So my question is for Fiorella. Earlier you touched on our attitudes towards parents and parenthood, and your kind of implicit ideal was that if we had better attitudes towards parents, then they wouldn't feel so socially, economically coerced into abortion, which I completely agree with. I think it's one of the points which the pro-life movement needs to tackle as a central focus. Do you believe, however, that sometimes the pro-life movement might, however accidentally or implicitly, be involved in that kind of prejudice and discrimination, especially against certain groups of parents, like young parents or disabled parents?
Yeah, so the question is it possible that the pro-life movement, by perhaps emphasising too much about parents, may also be playing into a discrimination against different types of families?
I have to say I don't think the pro-life movement does discriminate, say, against disabled parents. I've never felt that there was a particularly serious problem. I mean, if you have found that to be the case, I'd be interested to talk further about it. But I don't think that's so much a problem. I think what I meant was, on the one hand, materially speaking, it is very easy to be a mother these days compared with years ago. The law is much more on our side. There are more benefits available if you're a single mother, all sorts of things like that. But the rhetoric, particularly given to young women, is that being a mother is the worst thing that can possibly happen to you. It's a disaster. You have this baby to look after, and they cry, and they have snotty noses, and it's awful. And I think that's really that anti-natalist attitude that I'm very keen to challenge. People just assume that it is always a disaster. Whereas I come from a sort of culture where people usually say congratulations when you're pregnant. They're usually quite happy for you. Though I've noticed that when I got to baby number 3, people started saying, "Oh dear." You can say thanks and congratulations, and isn't that wonderful? But there's that negativity, and we forget that a baby is a child. A baby is just one particular phase. You're talking about a relationship that is so important and so valuable and gives so much joy. I think that's where we really need to work hard to try to break that notion that motherhood is imprisonment. It is also very empowering.
When you say disabled parents, do you mean the parents are disabled or parents of a disabled child?
I would say both. There's a social prejudice against both.
Yes.
As much as I don't believe the pro-life movement intends it sometimes, but I think some groups of people might hold this prejudice against parents.
I'm sure there is prejudice. I mean, human beings, we get things wrong. And maybe some things that some of us have said have worked the wrong way. But I think in general, the pro-life movement, certainly our intention would be to be entirely positive about human beings as a whole, as the human race as a whole. I mean, human beings are human beings, and what we want is to protect human beings.
Sorry, I think I slightly misunderstood.
Sure.
So I think I slightly misunderstood what you meant. I mean, when it comes to parents with disabled children, I think you are right. There is quite a strong prejudice, but I don't think it comes from within the pro-life movement. However, the late Alison Davis, I don't know how many of you knew her, God rest her soul. She ran the Disability Rights Division of SPUC, and she was very keen to encourage pro-life campaigners to be very careful about the way they express opinions about disability, because we'd be in a forum like this and someone would say, "Oh, they said my niece would have Down syndrome, but she turned out to be a beautiful, perfect baby," or "Oh, they said he'd be a vegetable." There are just certain words people use without realising that they're actually very discriminatory, and we do have to be a little bit careful about that. There's a need for constant self-examination.
Well, thank you very much to our extremely articulate panelists, Fiorella Nash, Robin Haig standing in for John Henry, and Dr. Pravan, who's unfortunately had to leave us early. Thank you very much.